a long history about that, and we could talk about it, and the conservation movement is, and you guys probably are well aware of this, has gone through various phases where they think about incorporating people and people's needs more, and then they go back to no, not so much in urban parks, but in more wildland parks, fortress mentality, let's kick the people out, it's all about conserving species, and then they say, no, it's not just about conserving species, it's about what those species deliver to people. And in fact, just as in political cycles, you see phases of those conversations. And so one perspective will take some ascendancy, and then there'll be a reaction to that, and the next perspective will take some ascendancy. And so I fully expect somewhere down the line a reaction to ecosystem services, and you're already seeing it in the conservation circles. Because people weren't attracted to conservation for human well-being, by and large. So people working in the global and national conservation organizations were attracted to it because they cared about saving species. But the ecosystem services are just broadly the goods and services that people get from ecosystems. So I wanted to ask you what you think some of those are in urban parks. And I know you're mainly working in these large urban parks, sort of more wilderness-oriented than playground-oriented. And yet I've done a lot of my work, and some of the stuff I may show you later is in those smaller parks. And so let's expand our view of parks to be everything from small to gigantic. What do you think the main services are that these parks are providing? Yeah.
Opportunities to connect children with nature.
Okay, opportunities to connect children to nature. I happen to value parks hugely, and maybe childlike, but I'm still glad they're here. But yes, so let's say children or people.
Families.
Families. Others. Yeah.
Fresh water, trees.
Fresh water. Why are trees a service?
Carbon sequestration.
Okay, carbon, climate regulation on small to large scales. Others?
Health and physical fitness.
Health and physical fitness, yes. Doesn't come out as prominently in the ecosystem services literature, just the fact that finding good places to go be and exercise and relax, because we know reducing stress is as important to health as exercise. Yeah, that would be another good one. Others you can think of?
Management of trash.
Management, oh gosh, tell me how that works. It gets
Well,
caught in the cacti and then you can pick it up and then...
I mean, it's leading people to treat the land properly.
Oh. So instilling a certain ethic.
In other words, you don't want to be dumping the wrong liquids in parks. You don't want to be, actually trashing, throwing away your excess food and so on, because that affects the wildlife.
Okay.
I mean, people don't think about that in terms of...
Well, right, so then you have to ask whether it's a service that's actually provided, but maybe through education it is, and then maybe it extends to other places besides urban parks. That's not what I thought of.
Okay.
Yeah.
About attracting businesses and residents to your region.
Ah, yes, okay, making it a place people want to live. A certain amenity value had on parks. Yeah, no, I think that's an important one. So, I brainstormed a few, and there's a couple here that you guys didn't say. So, genetic diversity. And I think this is true not just of these preserves where we're preserving native species, but I think cities have this capacity to become almost a distributed network of botanical gardens, right? Where we take rare and endangered species and start growing them in people's yards. Maybe not dangerous ones, but pleasing ones and aesthetic ones, and rather than just having them in seed banks somewhere. Potentially provisioning services. Now, I haven't defined services yet, and I'll get to that in a second, but we could imagine some parks in urban areas having urban gardens. We can certainly imagine large parks providing fuel wood or firewood or timber in places other than Phoenix, that we could think of that even in some places in Phoenix. So, there's some capacity for that level of service. And then we can also think about the capacities not just for water regulation or flood controls, but disease or fire regulation. And these can be services as well as disservices, right? So when we talk about ecosystem services, the flip side of that is that ecosystems can provide disservices as well. So if the park is being managed in such a way as to increase fire frequency or increase mosquitoes, Tempe Town Lake, I am convinced, is increasing mosquito population on Tempe. I live only a few blocks away from it, and the population's going up every year. Those can be disservices. There's other examples in the conservation literature of indigenous groups living very close to conservation reserves that have primates and diseases crossing that species barrier. And so we have to take those into account as well. As you probably know, maybe you don't, a couple of years ago on a global scale, we passed the mark where the majority of people were living in cities. And that's the first time in human history that's been true, right? We are now an urban species. Now in the US, we passed that mark long ago. And in Asia, we passed that mark, but Africa is still largely rural. So on a global scale, no one knows exactly when, right? We can have these population clocks and we can make you think that we know completely accurately what the world's population is, but of course we do not. So sometime probably around 2008, we passed that mark where we're now an urban species. And so back to the connecting children and families to nature, right? Our experience of nature is now just increasingly based on being an urban dwelling species. I make no judgments about that. There's a lot of people that say that unless you really get into nature, wilderness, you can't completely experience nature, but I grew up in the suburbs and we were as fascinated by the worms and ants that were in our little degraded creek in our park as we would have been had we gone out into the wilderness. And so I think children can have a range of experiences in the urban setting and connecting to me. I remember talking to Jeff Williams once at the Phoenix Zoo, who said that he really thought children just had to learn how to connect to any living thing, and that could be growing a carrot, right? I mean, it didn't have to necessarily be an animal, but understanding that life cycle. This is just showing you a picture of the urbanization in Phoenix from back when we were an agricultural valley to the yellow is urban to today, when you can just see how much urban sprawl we've experienced. Okay, so the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, I thought, provided a really nice framework for thinking about the different categories of ecosystem services. The first category is just provisioning. These are the things we take out of ecosystems, the food, right, the fuel wood, the fiber if you're wearing natural fibers. Genetic material for medicines and pharmaceuticals, right? Straightforward. The stuff, the tangible stuff that we can consume or use or wear or burn. The other was a set of regulating services. And these are those aspects of an ecosystem that can keep things within certain bounds. So, we don't talk about never having fires. We talk about having fewer and less large fires. We don't talk about never having disease outbreak, but we talk about trying to contain that. And so the regulating services can just be thought of as not eliminating, but potentially reducing the variability of systems so that they operate within certain bounds. So if you never want a fire that's bigger than this, then if the regulating service is working well, the ecosystem operates within those bounds. But you have to allow some of the natural variability, as you know. Storm protection, this has been in the news a lot lately. The presence of mangroves, reducing the impacts of storm surges on coastal environments, for instance. And then the third category is cultural services, and that's everything else, ranging from children's experiences of nature, a certain knowledge and education that comes from that, spiritual, aesthetic sense of place. We know from the report, the Arizona We Want, actually how important those landscapes of Arizona are to people, many of whom never go out to see them. But still, the fact that they're there matters to the people of Arizona. It matters to their identity. And so this is, a fairly broad set of things that can range from the very tangible, I'm out walking and I enjoy that, to the less tangible. There's something about my identity as a citizen of Arizona that is bound up in these places that we love. But the other thing the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment did was to say, what's happening to these services over the last several decades? What would you guess is happening to them?
I assume they're being integrated as the systems themselves are integrating.
Mostly true. the exception?
The cultural services. I don't know.
Actually, right here.
Oh,
I mean, if you think of how much food we produced today versus 50 years ago, we're producing more simply because there's more people. They basically found these patterns. There's some exceptions. And I'm not going to say everything in this category went up. Genetic diversity, for instance, has gone down. Right? Especially genetic diversity in the crop system, so that's a whole other topic. But these two things have gone down, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Okay. So this is taking hold, this focus on ecosystem services. You can see it in lots of different conversations. People are no longer just talking about species conservation for the sake of species conservation. They're talking about a much broader range of the ways in which ecosystems benefit people. And I happen to think this is a good thing, frankly, obviously since I'm working on it. But you know, there's a lot of people out there that don't share the values of preservation or conservation. And it's actually hard to tell them why they should necessarily embrace those values. That's never a productive conversation. Like, you should have a different set of values than you have. Never really gets people very far. And, you know, these people have lots of worries and concerns of their own, and they might see a different set of interests in nature than those of us who are eating well and living in great houses and able to enjoy nature as a wonderful, magical thing. Have. And so I actually think it opens up a really positive conversation, but it also has to shift our perspective on the landscapes that we want and how we create them. So my husband's an environmental economist, and he also works on biodiversity. And he's just finished a book that'll come out soon, but he's basically said that, you know, with all due respect to the environmentalist concerns, by and large created the landscapes we've wanted to create. We've cleared fields because we need food. We've eliminated top predators because they're dangerous. We've focused on vector-borne diseases because we don't want to get sick. I mean, the ways in which we have altered and changed and sometimes eradicated nature are being driven by what we want out of those systems. Now, imperfectly, and we'll come back to that. But, you know, in an order of magnitude way, these are the landscapes we wanted to create. Okay, so I actually think it opens up a more promising conversation. We can talk about any of this again in Berkeley whenever you want, but it's not without challenges. Okay, so it's great to say, fine, there's this whole range of ecosystem services that ecosystems provide, but then you need to know how they provide them. You need to be able to, in a sense, quantify that. How would creating a different landscape lead to a different set of delivery of services? And the other thing is, we need to know how valuable those services are. And I'm going to come back to that. But we need to know that because, in fact, we can never have it all. Right? We can never, on a single patch of land, have it all. We're making choices about what ecosystem services that patch of land is going to deliver. And then even in a collective, when we look at our landscapes as a whole, we're making choices about what the services are. Okay, so let's just take a set of services. This was a part of another exercise where we went through and tried to think of those services that were important to people of the valley but might be somewhat threatened or we would be in danger if they were degraded. I think we would all agree climate. If the urban heat island effect and climate change gets much worse, we're going to be in a bit of trouble. Water provisioning is a clearly important one. Control of invasive species. You know, we love our deserts and we're already having some challenges with invasive species in those systems. Air quality turns out to be somewhat important in the valley, and then aesthetics and recreation. That's some space in there. Okay? So, people focus on this one quite often and say, look, we should have desert landscaping wherever possible. You know, in yards and urban parks, and certainly here we would have desert landscaping. And I love that aesthetic. My own yard is xeriscaped. I think it's fantastic. But it doesn't come without consequences, right? And so, when I go talk to, I mean, this is going to be obvious to you guys, but when I go talk to other communities, and they'll say, well, of course you would put in desert landscaping in the yards of Phoenix. Why wouldn't you do that? Well, okay, why would we do that? You know, I've lost 2 of my arrows. But first of all, it actually makes the urban heat island effect worse. right? As you may or may not know, we were doing pretty well, and there was that wonderful ring of agriculture all around the city, because it was a gigantic swamp cooler. That's what it was. You poured water on the landscape, it evaporated, we cooled off. Good thing. You know, you can go into my neighborhood, which is just west of the University main campus in Tempe, flood irrigated. And at certain times of the year, as I drive my bike from campus across Mill Avenue, the temperature drops 5 degrees. You know, so, and I benefit from, sorry, I just slammed the mic. I benefit from that as a resident, that everyone else has decided to flood irrigate their yards. So we will get hotter as we stop distributing water on the landscapes and as we eat into the agricultural landscapes. Hotter air, hotter atmospheric conditions leads to more air quality problems. The atmospheric reactions for smog and other things are just partly dependent on temperature. The other thing is, depending on how people have xeriscaped yards, there's more dust, potentially. That doesn't have to be. Invasive species control also goes down. You know, back when we had grass and citrus trees, these were not going to escape in the desert. It's just not going to happen. But it's not as if people are planting only natives in xeriscaped yards. And I'm okay with that, right? People have a right to create the kinds of conditions and environments they want to create in their homes, but it is a potential reservoir of invasive species moving out into the desert. And aesthetics and recreation, I would say, are mixed. Right? I love the aesthetic of desert yards. But I can also understand why people with small children do not want really spiny things right outside the door. And so, you know, again, you have to think about these trade-offs. And so, how do you think about this? Is xeriscaping a good idea? How do you know that? I mean, if it makes all these other things go down, and it helps with water provisioning, maybe makes aesthetics go up, how do we know it's a good idea?
Depends on your priorities.
Yeah, we'd have to evaluate it a bit further. We'd have to say, what are the values of each of these? How much do I lose if it gets hotter versus how much do I gain if I save more water, right? And this is not a, yeah.
I dispute that. We know it's good because that's the natural environment here. And if you put in grass or other types of shrubbery that aren't indigenous, then you have to do something to make them grow.
Yeah.
Which means using other provisions.
Yeah.
So that having it natural is better than trying to create a Garden of Eden.
I mean, because we create non-natural environments all the time just to meet our needs.
No,
what would
but
you like to see?
I'm not saying we're not creating it. The question was, how do we know it's better? And it's better because that's natural.
Why is natural better?
Because Mother Nature made it that way.
But how do we survive if we just let Mother Nature take over? Here we are. This is a concrete slab. This is not native vegetation. Should we get rid of this?
If we can.
How about the concrete slab under your house?
Well, okay. I'm an engineer, architectural engineer. You want an answer, I'll give you an answer.
The thing is I go back to the point that we've created the landscapes we've created to meet our needs. And nature has a role in that, but so do human-modified landscapes have a role in that. Yeah.
You know, one thing I always, even as a kid, I took exception to is when people call things natural.
And we're not natural.
Yeah, and that connotation that it didn't involve human beings.
Yeah, I agree.
Because I think that we're part of the ecosystem. And we seem to be kind of a generation or two behind, because one generation will do something like putting concrete slabs and the next one will go, you know, we don't like these concrete slabs, so get rid of them. You know, and so we seem to be bouncing back and forth with what we perceive as being undesirable, but yet it's all created by humans because we try to save everything else, you know, that we haven't got damaged. But we're part of the ecosystem.
I agree with you that it seems quite artificial to say that we're not natural when we're a product of evolution like any other species. And I've always found that distinction bizarre.
So, you know, one of the things that you talked about earlier is, you know, what we value,
Right.
and not every single human being whether in this room or in this state or in the world, values the same things or things in the same way. But one of the things that I concern myself with as a conservation biologist is, yes, we are part of the system. We can't set humans aside and say, humans are not part of the system. You know, like you said, sometimes the ethic is we're going to create a fence around pieces and say, people stay out because we want to protect nature. But humans have had this inordinate influence. Some would say positive, some would say negative. I say it's mixed on all the systems. But when it's negative, it's such a big negative that at some point we end up hurting ourselves.
I agree with that too.
And if we value ourselves, and I don't just mean like me, but we as species, we gotta pay attention. We can't just do everything we want. You say we create the landscapes we want or that we need, but there are better ways and worse ways and smarter ways and not so smart ways.
I agree with all of that. I rebel a little bit against the notion that everything should be natural because, of course, we've created playgrounds for kids and we think that that's okay, actually, that they should have some sand and some swing sets, and that's not very natural. And, I grew up in the suburbs with a lawn where we played kickball, and that would have been hard in really tall prairie grass of Illinois. And, we've moved crops all over the world so that we can enjoy a diverse diet, and I'm okay with that as well. So I don't instinctively think people's yards should be natural, but I also agree that in the broader realm of things, while we have, again, when I say order of magnitude, I would say, if these are our ideal landscapes, keeping in mind what people value, and then we look at the landscapes we've created, they're not overlapping yet. And there's reasons for that you all know about and we can talk about. Anyway, I think the answer to this is we don't know until we figure out what people value, not just us in this room, but people more broadly. And then how those values, how human well-being changes if we make different choices about xeriscaping versus not xeriscaping. Okay, then that sounds easy, but it's not at all easy.
I'm just thinking, my take on this is just maybe evaluating what's xeriscape. It doesn't mean only gravel. Maybe, for example, I talk about citrus trees. Why not just replacing a tree with a tree that just requires less water, like a pomegranate, for example? So you still maintain the same vegetation amount. So you could still have climate regulation, still have air quality, but you would reduce the amount of water that you need.
I'm having trouble hearing. Is there
Yeah, it's loud over there.
no, they're all in the gift shop. I thought they were all standing right outside the door. Okay, well, I'm glad you're excited about what's on offer.
Lively fest.
We can hear you fine though.
Okay, yes and no. I mean, some people may really want a citrus tree. But I absolutely agree. We could increase knowledge about what the consequences of that are. We could increase incentives for planting some kinds of things over others. But we also have to recognize we're making a choice about air temperature when we do that. I would say making the choice about those trade-offs would mean knowing at least approximately, because exactly may be way too high of a goal, approximately how different landscapes, different configurations, different patches would contribute to each of those services, and then knowing something about the value of each of those services. Now both of those are actually really hard. So everyone's come up with this great framework of ecosystem services and what are the goods and benefits people get out of ecosystems, and now we have a huge amount of work to do to even figure out how you implement that framework. Where are we for time? 12:30. So let me just say a little bit about value. I'm not an economist, but I've spent a lot of time working with economists. And again, I agree that there's lots of ways and lots of diversity of values, but we still have to make collective choices about our destiny. And so in these provisioning services, it's actually somewhat straightforward. It's not perfect, but it's somewhat straightforward because we buy them, by and large. And we demonstrate, given, if we're willing to pay more for a pomegranate than an orange, then we demonstrate that we value pomegranates more than oranges. That may be because they're more scarce. That may be for a variety of other reasons. But we get to vote every day in the marketplace on the value we place on corn versus squash versus beans versus other things. And again, it's not perfect because all of the environmental impacts of agriculture are not taken into account in the price of those products, but it at least, to first order, gives us a sense of how much people value these things. Regulating services are not traded in the marketplace. We don't get to buy, as an individual, air quality regulation, right? Better air quality. We can't buy it for ourselves without buying it for everyone in the neighborhood, right? So economists have to use different approaches to that. One is replacement costs, so you could just say, well, the value of flood regulation provided by the ecosystem can be estimated by how much it would cost to put in the dam and levee system that would provide equivalent protection. And the other is called avoided damage costs. So if I can reduce fires by 10%, what does that mean for people's houses, livelihoods, health? You try to add all of that up. And so you can place a value on fire or disease regulation. But again, as you can imagine, non-trivial. Trying to figure out exactly how many homes were saved, what those were worth, what is the statistical cost of a human life? And in fact, I mean, this is a digression, but if you look at the choices we make, we are not consistent about the statistical cost of a human life. All right, so if you back out, and here's my favorite example. So sometimes you ask people this, and they're like, it's infinite, right? The human life, the value of human life is infinity. And yet, we voted all over the West to raise speed limits from 65 to 75 miles per hour. And we can figure out exactly how much we think a human life is worth based on that choice. So we spend more money on gas, we use less fuel efficient, so take that out of the equation. We save time, so that's the benefit side. We spend money on gas, and the difference is what we think a human life is worth. Because more people die when the speed limit is 75 than 65. And I don't know what that value is, but it's not very high. Anyway, that's what we can do in regulating. And in cultural services, there's a couple of different techniques. One is just willingness to pay. You might have heard this. You just wander around and say, how much would you be willing to pay for this? And it's not a very good technique because people will say, you know, if you're not really going to take the money from me, then I can say anything, right? $1 million. And the other thing is their willingness to pay really does depend on other people's willingness to pay, right? If they see it as a community value, they're often more willing to pay for it than if they don't see it as a community value. And then there's another thing called hedonic pricing. So yes, it's from hedonist. And basically what you can do in at least some cases is figure out how much people actually did pay for a particular service. So when you buy a car, you're paying, whatever you pay for it, $17,000. You've paid for a certain kind of engine and a certain kind of transmission and the shape of the taillights and the color and the racing stripe. And if economists can get enough data, you know, 1 million car purchases and all of the attributes of the car, they can tell you how much you were willing to pay for that racing stripe on average. And so they do all of these things, but this is a huge amount of work to get the value of just a few ecosystem services. But the other thing I wanted to add here is that it's not an accident that we haven't perfectly created the landscapes we should want. And it's because we get to vote on these. And the negotiations for these are not as straightforward. We don't get to integrate the votes of everyone living in the valley based on what they buy. We have to negotiate these through regulations, through rules, through trying to secure these services in different ways. Most of these can't be traded on the market. They're what's called public goods. Public goods, by definition, can't be traded in the market. They can't be supplied by the market. They have to be supplied by a collective decision through governments, the fundamental and essential role of governments to provide these public goods. And so because we haven't had, because those have to be negotiated, we've missed the mark on these. We've undersupplied these, and we've oversupplied these. There's no doubt about that. So now we need, and you know what, when there was only a few thousand of us wandering around the landscapes, we didn't even have markets for provisioning services. So we did actually, we would trade with each other, right? These weren't very threatened. There's no need to set up regulation of something if it's abundant and free and not being degraded. Just let it be a free public good. But we overshot that mark a long time ago in terms of the population of the planet, and we haven't caught up yet. Now we're starting mechanisms to learn how to pay for these things. So I'm sure you've probably heard about payments for ecosystem services. There are these schemes whereby the people who want a certain set of ecosystem services will pay the folks that can provide those. We supposedly do this in this country through payments to farmers. These have just turned into great subsidies that have very little to do with ecosystem services, but set that aside. You know, we pay for pollination in some cases. And it can be quite useful. We're starting to pay for carbon sequestration. Yeah.
There's also, for many regulated services, a surrogate in the form of insurance costs.
Yes.
And hedging costs,
Yes,
which is a market.
Yeah.
So there are ways to at least approximate. The issue is, would planting wetlands in fact reduce my flood insurance sufficiently
Right.
to offset the cost of establishing wetlands?
Right. But if we wanted it on a broader scale to understand that, we could look at how insurance companies treat different landscapes with respect to the cost of insurance. And that often is under avoided damage costs that the insurance companies are good at this. The reinsurance companies are even better at this because they're the ones who are worried about what's going to happen 10 or 20 years out. You know, payments works in some systems and not in others. There was a big World Bank study about upstream and downstream users of water. So downstream users paying the upstream users of water to leave some water in the system. And that works in some cases, but in something like 50% of the cases, the downstream water users were actually poorer than the upstream water users, and so they couldn't muster enough market power to convince the upstream users to leave some water. Hence the danger of markets, because the rich get to vote way more than the poor. It's not one man, one vote, it's $1, one vote. And so if you're rich, you get more votes. Yeah.
I'm still troubled about the fact that waste management is really not included in this ecosystem.
Well, it would be under here, but it wouldn't be trash. I mean, it would be things like cleaning the air, cleaning the water. There's a whole set of services I haven't talked about underneath this that the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment called supporting services. Nutrient cycling, decomposition, net primary production, all of those basic ecological functions that have to be in place to get any of these. So certainly clean air. So when they are talking about air quality, and there's water regulation in here as well, it's water quality. It's the fact that water filtered through natural systems will get cleaned and then delivered in a fresh way to us. So there should be dots here. This is not an exhaustive list. So that, that's one problem with payments. Is that it, and here's another problem, and then I come back to this notion of the rich get to vote more. Paying for carbon sequestration, good or bad idea? Yeah, so what are the mixed results? What's happening?
From what I know, I learned that the value of a timber tree is actually worth more than how much we get, or how much, let's say, a company would want to buy a tree to sequester carbon in a third world country, but those people would actually get much more if they'll just hack the tree down and sell it. So that's a little problematic.
No, it depends on what you do with the timber, right? Because this is still sequestering carbon. It's not in the atmosphere, it's still in that piece of wood. So if you burn it, problematic, all the carbon goes into the atmosphere. If there's a lot of waste that decomposes as you process the timber, that carbon goes into the atmosphere. If you make heirloom tables that people are going to pass down for 14 generations, that carbon's still sequestered. So it does depend on what you do with the carbon. What are some of the other issues associated with carbon sequestration? In fact, if you wanted to sequester as much carbon as possible, what would you do? So the challenge, right, is to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and stick it into something. What would you do if you were in charge of the world? And that's all you cared about, getting as much carbon out of the atmosphere as you could.
Stop putting it in.
But we're going to use ecosystems here. What would you do? If you were managing this through ecosystems,
Plant fast-growing trees.
you would plant eucalyptus everywhere, right? And then you would cut it down and you would throw it into the deep ocean. Because that's where all the carbon goes eventually anyway. It's just not going there fast enough for our purposes. And it stays down there for really long periods of time once it gets down there. So, if costs were no object, if all you cared about were carbon, plant eucalyptus, you chop them down, you take them out by tanker, you weight them down, and you throw them into the deep ocean. And we could suck a lot of carbon out of it. Bad idea, right? Because every other service we care about from ecosystems would be compromised. The other thing, water is a big issue here, right? A meta-analysis, which is just a fancy way of saying, hey, we looked at a lot of different studies, and what did we find? I didn't do this, someone else did this. In these reforested watersheds, not surprisingly, water availability goes down. There's less water being delivered to streams in reforested watersheds because trees use up a lot of water. Okay, so in some places planting more trees is a great idea, and in other places it's a terrible idea. And so we have this system, markets are about one commodity. And now if you suddenly start paying people for carbon, but none of the other services that trees might provide, they're going to oversupply carbon and undersupply all the rest of the services because there's no incentive to provide those other services. So there's, again, real challenges. And how do you think about incentivizing, bundles of services? And I don't have the right answers to that. People are really working hard on this, but we need an integrated analysis of what it is we value and the different ways we can get those values. Some will be marketed, some will be regulations, some will be incentives. Some will be thou shalt not, ever, never, maybe sometimes, or hey, if you feel like it, you could do this and we would give you some money for that. And it's going to have to be a mix of all of those things. And we're going to have to revisit that mix as people's values change. Right? So as we get more secure, we tend to move up this chart, right? We care about recreation and aesthetics after we've filled our bellies, much more than we care about it when we're starving. And so as we change economically and as we change culturally, what we value on these lists will change as well. So the values changing in identity culturally as well, and that can mean differences. Let's see. 15 minutes. Let me just take you quickly through. So this will go fairly fast. As I said before, I worked in small desert parks almost a decade ago now when I first came to Phoenix. So the city parks where kids went and played. It was actually a lot of fun because you just hang out in parks and you said you were doing research. It was a great thing. And for some reason this is definitely a digression, but I'll show you, we were measuring a lot about trees and we needed to get a certain distance away from the tree. So we had those rolling tape measures. Kids loved those things. And so, we had to go 100 feet away from the tree and they always wanted to roll out the distance. So we would let them, they couldn't go in a straight line to save their lives. And so, we would be standing behind them like this, trying to get them to go straight. And we decided it was worth being off a little bit in accuracy for the sheer joy of engaging them in research. But what we were looking at was bird diversity, and this is not necessarily an ecosystem service, except that it does provide opportunities for bird watching, recreation, relaxation, and then you could say it's connected to genetic diversity. And we looked at 16 different neighborhood parks in 3 different neighborhood types. So there was high income, medium income, and low income neighborhoods, and you can see where they're distributed. They're not north to south, east to west, not uniformly distributed. We picked these parks in a very specific way. So for whatever reason, neighborhood parks in Phoenix, and this was Phoenix proper, wasn't the surrounding cities, always seem to occur at the corners of census blocks. And maybe it's because those blocks are defined by major roads, and they often put parks at the corners of major roads, but that's where they occur. And there's this market survey analysis that gives you huge amounts of information about different social groups. They divide it into 64 different categories, and it doesn't matter. And then there's sort of 16 uber social groups that share certain characteristics, but not just income. So, one of the things I don't have up here is in one of the social groups, there was sort of towns and gowns and Middleburg managers. They have these great names for the things. And Middleburg managers were very likely to belong to fraternal orders, and towns and gowns are very likely to watch Deep Space Nine. They tell you things like this. The only thing that I could see that unified those two groups was that they were both more likely than average to buy frozen boneless chicken. I don't know why. Anyway, what we did was we picked out parts where the surrounding social groups were all the same. What we wanted to do was to see, does neighborhood matter? Do people matter? Do people as part of the system matter? And then we went, and we picked all the parks we could where the surrounding social groups were the same. And that ended up with 16. And went out into bird, by we, I mean other people who can actually identify birds, which is not me. Okay. I did do experiments because we also did bird counts. And we had really different bird counts. 3 different observers would go out. So I made them do little tests. I would take a thing of ping pong balls, and then they would be standing here, right? And this would be a wall, so they couldn't see me. And I would sit and throw the same ping pong balls across the doorway and say, okay, how many was that? Just to see how good they were at estimating numbers, right? And to try to train them to estimate numbers better. Because, they just see a flock of birds and they have to try to estimate numbers. Anyway, they went out, they looked at birds both in the park, 15-minute, it doesn't matter. They counted birds 4 times a year. And we got these, here's what we got. Highest bird count was sort of 33 in terms of species. This isn't abundance, this is just the number of species we saw. Lowest was 15. What explains these patterns? And this is just one service and trying to disentangle how you'd want to set up your landscapes to deliver this service. Okay, traditional explanations. Ecology, which has specialized in non-human dominated systems. So they don't have a lot of theories that incorporate people. And the ones they do basically say people are really bad. And they destroy the landscape. So that's oversimplifying. I'm an ecologist, so I feel like I can pick on them. But they would say, oh, you are from the urban center, the closer you get to the urban center, the more degraded the environment, fewer species it can support. Population density also bad. People are just bad. And then they'd also say, hey, if you get more vegetation structure, you can support more birds, right? You can get the birds that like to be in the grass, plus the ones that like to be in the shrubs, plus the ones that like to be at the tops of trees. If you have more complex vegetation structure, you're going to get more birds. So we measured all the trees and shrubs in the park. All right, this is a nice one, because this is not a desert tree, and you can actually get here. We found that diameter at breast height for desert trees makes no sense whatsoever. You cannot do that, so we did diameter at base, but it often meant crawling into this vegetation. I actually did do this, because I can carry a tape measure. I can't identify birds, but I can carry a tape measure. We did this for 3,000 trees or something in the 16 parks in the summer. I don't know what we were thinking. And measured tree height, measured a bunch of stuff. And we counted all the shrubs and identified them to whatever possible species. Yeah, it was 2,000 trees, sorry. 3,384 shrubs and other perennials. Okay, then we had a bunch of other park characteristics. Lots of birds. There were 65 birds found in the course of 1 year, 10 species in all 16 parks. These are the 10. Some of them are native, some of them not so much. And again, what explains these patterns? So what we did was we threw in all the things that ecologists tell us should matter. Stuff about the trees, stuff about the size. I didn't talk about it, but time since disturbance should matter. Once a disturbance occurs, it's assumed species go away, then they come back. We did the geographic position, north, south, east, west, because we were trying to both correct for that gradient. Most of the lower income parks were down in the south. We wanted to make sure it wasn't position that mattered, and also to try to correct for where the larger urban parks were that might be a source of these birds. But we threw in something about the people, the median family income in the area surrounding the park. And this is just for the parks. I know we went out into the neighborhoods to count birds, but these results are just for the parks, little parks. And then we did this thing called the stepwise regression. It doesn't matter in statistics. What you find is the thing that most influences bird diversity is median family income. And then this other stuff matters. The trees, the vegetation matter. And then north-south location matters a little bit, but not as much. And then you can do something else. We threw in a few more things. Median year the house was built, percent Hispanic Latino. Can we get some more neighborhood characteristics? And again, you just find, I lost one slide in there. Oh, no, here it comes out again. So median family income, again, the most important determinant of bird diversity in the park. Nothing about the park, just the neighborhood surrounding it. Median year house is built, and then percent Hispanic Latino, okay? Population density didn't matter. Distance from urban center didn't matter. Okay, crossed off. And then here's what you get. Rich people are simply experiencing more bird diversity in their parks. And this is not because of the characteristics of the parks. This is not because of anything park managers are doing, right? It's because of the characteristics of the neighborhood by and large. I shouldn't say it's nothing, because the vegetation structure matters. And they have, in Phoenix, changed the way that they vegetate parks over time. But it's still mostly about the surrounding neighborhood. They're in the challenge of managing these ecosystem services. You know, how do you think about all of the things? And so then we went through and we did a whole bunch of other stuff to say, gosh, can we explain that pattern? Can we look at habitat in the neighborhood, not just in the park? What are we seeing about vegetation in the neighborhood? Can we look at food availability? So who's feeding birds in their yards? One interesting result there was that middle-income neighborhoods tend to feed birds a little bit more than upper income or lower income, but they also tended to feed birds in their front yard more. So they wanted people to know that they were feeding birds. Whereas in other neighborhoods, they put them in the backyard. And it was a weird thing. We counted cats. We had heat and motion detecting cameras in the parks, and we counted the number of feral cats, and we also did early morning surveys of feral cats, and we also did household surveys about how many people had outdoor cats. And we looked at disturbance. We looked at noise measurements, how many people were using the park. Again, no real differences in the use of parks from lower to upper income in terms of the number of people, but the way they use the parks, surprisingly, is not different. And so in the upper income neighborhoods, it tended to be more solitary individuals, either jogging or sitting on a bench reading, and older quite often. And in the lower income, there was many more group activities and active versus passive. And young boys use parks way more than young girls. So we did these sweeps. Anyway, I won't take you through the details, but the results were just this. There's a lot of work. This is just for one service, right? Trying to figure out what mattered and what didn't. Neighborhood structure of vegetation did matter. Food availability, not so much. Predation did matter, and disturbance didn't seem to have any impact. But that wasn't, how this extends to the kinds of parks you guys are running is a tougher question. But part of the issue is that the surrounds will matter. And so delivering services within your park may well require managing, quote, managing to the extent that you can, influencing things surrounding the park. And that gets complicated. Yeah.
Do you have any examples of what in the habitat made a difference?
I have a very stylized picture of what we found. Consider this a household. If you go to the low-income neighborhoods, the diversity of yard type from house to house is incredibly different. One house will be gravel, and then there'll be this stunning flowering garden, and then there might be a food garden, and then there might be xeriscaping. So they don't make any effort. And again, I make no judgments. They make no effort to conform to what their neighbors are doing. Middle income and upper income neighborhoods both make an effort to conform. The upper income neighborhoods most of all. One front yard looks much like the next front yard, and this may be because the same developer did it, or they're more likely to have HOAs, but they're very diverse. So the amount of species we found, the number of species we found in upper income neighborhoods was the highest, but it was almost, it's high in every yard. So what the birds are seeing are both a lot of vegetation diversity, but also a more continuous habitat. And what they're seeing in middle income neighborhoods is not so much diversity, more conformity, so more continuous habitat, but not a lot of diversity, but that continuity mattered. And then in lower income neighborhoods, they're seeing a fair amount of diversity in terms of species richness, because people are planting different things, but no continuous habitat. There's just little islands of certain vegetation types. And so it's not a connected landscape from the bird's perspective. That's what we were finding. Yeah.
There was a lecture actually at the Desert Botanical Garden probably about 8 or 10 years ago, done by an ASU researcher who was studying the bird population over 50 years at the Desert Botanical Garden. And as the garden developed, actually, the number of birds increased exponentially, something like 1,500 times.
The number or the number of species? The abundance or the number of species?
I think it was both the number, well, species, no, that wouldn't apply to species. No, it was the number of birds.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it was species, I don't know, it was a while ago.
Yeah.
But I was very impressed by the fact that as the garden developed, more and more,
Well, so I would
you
ask what
supported
the,
more bird
what the
population.
surrounding landscape properties were. We actually do see higher abundance of birds in the city than in the desert. One quick guess as to why.
Water there?
Water, they have water. So it may have been the botanical garden, or it might have been just all of the neighborhoods that cropped up around the botanical garden where we now have water.
Yeah.
I mean, you can, and we can, and it's also predation. Predation is change. So there's, you know, I love ecologists because they do such low-cost experiments sometimes. There's something called the giving up density. So some of our birders, you just put out hands of sand and seed, and then you come back later and you collect them and you see how much seed was left in the pan. And if there's almost no seed left, it means the birds felt threatened by nothing, right? La la la, I'm just gonna hang out here and eat. And if there's a lot of seed left, it means you're feeling threatened. And you can put it near to a shrub or far from a shrub or near to a house or far from it. And you can start to get the risk landscape from a bird's perspective. But also some more time spent on food means less, is partly because there's less time that needs to be spent on water. So the giving up density in dry neighborhoods would actually be higher. There'd be more seed left in that pan than in wet neighborhoods because they have only a certain amount of time in the day, and you know they're busy, either getting food or water or mates or hiding. That's what they're doing when they're not sleeping.
What did you find about predation related to economic levels?
Okay, so there was it was the cameras were different than when we actually went out there and just looked. When we went out there and just looked, not surprisingly, there's more feral cats in the low-income neighborhoods, and there's more outdoor cats in low-income neighborhoods. So far more likely that people are just letting. So there's we couldn't tell the difference between feral cats and non-feral cats when we were looking. I mean, we didn't zoom in with night vision binoculars to see if they had a tag. So there were more cats. Okay, the cameras didn't have much of a significant relationship, and mainly what we caught were pictures of people looking at the camera. And I wouldn't recommend putting cameras in the Phoenix parks. Most of them were stolen and trashed, and so we found more cats in the lower income neighborhoods. But actually, I mean, since I shouldn't animate things. The abundances don't follow the species, right? So the avian species richness is highest in the high income neighborhoods and lowest in the low income, but the abundance in the winter is an inverted U. There's greater abundance of birds in middle income neighborhoods and lower in the high and low income neighborhoods. It's less diverse, but there's more birds. I don't know why. And in the breeding season, it goes exactly the opposite. I mean, the abundance, not the diversity of birds, this could all be pigeons, of course. This might be let us speak. So what this means, let me just say this simply. The species we find in low-income parks, we find in upper-income parks and middle-income parks. It's not a different community of birds. It's just that birds drop out as we go from upper income to lower income, by and large. Not perfect. So there's a few kinds of birds that like to be near domesticated animals. So in neighborhoods where they keep cows and pigs and stuff, there's a few other birds that kind of creep in. But by and large, what happens is lots of birds in the upper income neighborhood of different types. Same birds, but fewer types in middle income. Same birds, but fewer types in lower income. That's what we see.
How'd you measure income?
Oh, just from census just from, so it was, I just want to put this up because again, people did a huge amount of work besides me on the bird survey. But yes, we just did census data. We had a lot, you get a lot of information from the census and then from this market analysis, which ours was so, not surprisingly, when people do these market analyses, it's really expensive, and the only way to get a cheap one is to get a dated one. So ours was sort of 7 or 8 years old, but nonetheless, we use the latest census and a dated market analysis.
So I was thinking about something with regard to the city parks, Ken. And like we're out here at Usury and it's surrounded by affluent neighborhoods, a big, big park, rural setting, not urbanized all around it. And I would assume that it would have greater species diversity, although I should be careful of that, but, or certain services maybe are more present or whatever, for lack of a better word, here than at North Mountain Park, let's say. And so if we wanted to manage for a certain service, whatever it was that we chose, managing for biodiversity or managing for one of the other aesthetic or cultural services, or bird diversity, let's say, we would almost have to work with the surrounding community to create a more continuous habitat. I'm thinking about what
out here, as far as I can see.
they're doing great out here, but like at North Mountain, where it's fully urbanized all the way around, when you're talking about surrounding neighborhood, it's making me think, as project coordinator, about some of the things we might need to do if we want to manage for certain services, reaching out to the surrounding
But it may not
community.
just be vegetation, right? So if that seems too challenging, that's not the neighborhood aesthetic to have desert landscaping. You could say, okay, could we create incentives to put out water features?
Yeah.
I mean, for better or worse, I probably shouldn't have this, but we do. We have this little gurgling fountain in our side yard at home because I love the sound. But the thing is hundreds of birds come to that thing, and we can be sitting right, here's our chairs, here's the gurgling fountain, and we can just watch hummingbirds go drink some water, and there's just a ton of birds that come to that thing, and I love
I
it.
think about pollinators a lot because pollinators are on my mind. So if we could, have, I don't know, a pollinator garden program that we build out or something like that.
That's a really good example because Phoenix actually did that in conjunction with Audubon Center
Yeah,
down
I
in
know
Central.
about that project.
We had the Migratory Bird Project,
Yes.
and that was an effort to, educate mainly young people about the importance of the flyway and the fact that people are coming through and the impact that major urban centers have on birds, particularly migratory birds. And what I learned through that whole process is it's not just the fact that, the Rio Salado is a really important stopover point because of all the, biodiversity there and water sources and all of those things. But the biggest single thing in the urban environment that's affecting migratory birds is cats. Cats outdoors, that's the single biggest thing. And so then you get into the whole issue of if you want to deal with and enhance them, it's not just, the low-income neighborhoods that don't have, vegetation and water sources and things like that. It's that, maybe one neighbor does, but the next door neighbor's got, feeding, 25 or 30 feral cats, and they go over to the neighbor's yard after they got water at your yard, and the cats eat them all.
Right.
So those are the big issues. The biggest issues that we have to face in a big urban area like this. In fact, part of that agreement was, and some people might argue this point, was an agreement that Phoenix could not have or be participate in any sort of a trap litter release program because of statistics that shows that program doesn't work in terms of getting rid of feral cats. It's kind of a temporary Band-Aid fix on it. So that's a really good example of something that a big city could do and has done, but it was on a very, very limited basis in how you make that. How you teach people about the value of that and how do they understand where they live in this island basically and how they make that connection. Hummingbirds are a really good example, and that's why we did the pollinator garden down there at the Audubon Center because kids can see it, they can observe it. We actually took that program and transplanted the same program all the way up at Camp Collie up on the Mogollon Rim. The idea that kids go from one place to another 150 miles away and they can see the exact same bird and get that whole concept of what migration is all
Yeah.
about. And then when you go back home, you realize, what can I do at home that's going to help that hummingbird make its 3,000-mile journey from South America to Alaska? So that is a really, really good example of that. But there are so many complexities in an urban area. You talk about rounding up the cats. Go to Encano Park and talk about rounding up the freaking cats. The neighbors over there will, start warfare over trying to get rid of the feral.
So, but it does open up the other opportunities for, so if you say you can only do the one thing and that one thing's impossible and throw up your hands and give up, then that's not very engaging. So in a sense, what you can say is, look, it may not be perfect, but there's a lot of different things we could do. We could incentivize bird fountains, or putting bells on at least domesticated cats, or thinking about vegetation, or carefully placed. And you can engage the neighborhood in saying, okay, if we care about the birds, which of these things are we willing to do? We don't have to be confronted with only one option that we don't like, and therefore we're not part of the solution. There's other ways it could be part of the solution. And so, again, at least, we have to accept that complexity exists, so then we can embrace that complexity and say, aha, maybe that gives us multiple avenues into engaging the surrounding community and delivery of ecosystem services. So, and in this case, we know what the impact is, and in a lot of other cases, we think we know, but we don't really know what's going on.
That's the point, because all these data just about from wild populations and wild habitats is that bird species diversity increases with vegetation structure complexity.
Yes.
That relationship is intense.
When you take humans out of the picture,
Yeah.
it's incredibly important.
So, it depends upon if you're managing for diversity, if you're managing for species. And in what period in the bird's life cycle are you
Yep.
really wanting to focus on? Where's the weak point?
Yeah.
Is it on wintering grounds? Or maybe species diversity doesn't matter, or habitat diversity is a certain type of habitat, a food resource that's missing. So, all of those are things that you can do in wildland situations and more rural settings, as opposed to what you might want to do in the urban setting.
Well, but even in the urban setting, let's take a big cat lover who's busy feeding cats like crazy, and maybe the neighbors don't like it. So could you think about vegetation structure in the neighboring yards that would allow for some refuge, at least cut down on predation, and convince that cat lover to feed the cats closer to the house, right? So the birds have more of a fighting chance of getting away from the bird. You could, even on smaller scales, think about how you could structure those landscapes to provide more refuge. Not 100%.
Yeah, one of the things we were doing in some new neighborhoods is to have the HOAs eliminate bird feeding. Because essentially what you're doing is you're drawing the birds to be trapped by cats. And so the few people that you will never be able to control, because they're just these, these inordinate cat lovers, you will not keep them in. So just make sure that the birds don't have an opportunity to get captured by them by no feeding. And that includes hummingbirds, because cats will be out at night doing the nectar feeding bat things if you're in southern Arizona. So, no feeding the animals. And people say, well, we need to feed them. Well, you don't need to feed them. So
Yeah, they'll come in
the
anyway.
mind shift change with people.
But we do that same thing with water. I did want to point out, again, we looked at a lot of things, and so bird feeding practices were no differences in feeding frequencies, but the high income gave more, not somewhat surprisingly, more commercial seed and sugar water, and low income was busy throwing out bread. So, they were attracting different, they were feeding what they could afford to feed them. And it's still a connection of their children to nature.
Right.
So that's a tough one.
Trade-offs
everywhere.
Trade-offs.
Trade-offs everywhere.
I've been wondering, it's going back to your first question, is does Xeriscape is good or bad, or what should we do? I was wondering how would you approach it? What would you recommend your friends or neighbors to do in their yard?
I would need much more of the data than I have. And CAP LTERs and on the acknowledgements, they do a lot of this. They do a lot of heat island modeling, water availability, and how it's distributed on the landscape. I have really strong feelings that as a representative at a public university, it's not for me to tell people what they should value. It's for me to reveal the consequences of their choices and say, was that consistent with what you wanted? So, back to the speeding example, to the 65 to 75. Academics should have in fact said, well, you know what, it turns out if you make this choice that you're placing and making this number up, so do not quote it. You're basically saying a statistical life is worth $35,000. Are you comfortable with that choice? And then let people make another decision if they're uncomfortable with that choice. So I wouldn't tell them what to do or what not to do, and I would never actually do it at the individual level. I think these are much more community level decisions that need to be made. So I could see saying to Tempe city managers, you know what, we actually are really going to have a big problem with the urban heat island effect. And we actually do need to think about judicious use of water or vegetation or something. Green roofs aren't such a great idea in the desert, to offset that. Some of that could be distributing water on the landscape, some of it could be other ways of doing things. But maybe our large urban parks should continue to be flood irrigated. I'd rather they used reclaimed water, some of them do. Choose this, here's what temperatures are going to be, here's what water use is going to be, here's what other things might be. And if you choose this, these are this other set of trade-offs. And I'd much rather the elected officials, who presumably are elected because they reflect the values of the people who elected them. Again, a rich-poor problem, but okay. Better than me, not elected by anyone, to make decisions on behalf of people, telling people what to do.
It's funny to me, there's always a lag period too, because it's like on this pig meal thing where all of a sudden everybody wants to save the pig meal. I think it's going to cost my kids 13% or $13,000 more for a home. The same the whole organic gardening thing, talking about using reclaimed water. There's a bill right now to put the cost of putting manure, chicken manure on fields. They're going to outlaw that for certain farms, certain sizes that are commercial because of the potential for salmonella and disease.
Yep.
So the same thing with some of this reclaimed stuff, and we're finding a lot of things in Raptors, like this cross-bill anomaly where, we had the DDT thing that went away when we banned DDT. Birds are doing well.
Except it's still sitting in fat in a lot of
And in
species,
the ocean
right?
populations, on the edges of the country, the margins by the oceans, but now we're getting this other thing. What does it do from all the pharmaceuticals going into water that's used in reclaimed lands?
That's right.
So we can't just say we're going to put that on there. But so it's always a thing, well, we're going to put water on there. Well, then the next generation finds out that water is not as good as we thought.
Right.
So there always seems to be
Well, we
that
can only do
lag
as
time.
best we can, right? We can't say, well, gosh, if we had the knowledge that we would have 50 years
No,
from
we think
now.
we're doing it perfect, and we are for our generation.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
saying that the next generation
Yeah, yeah.
says, you guys screwed up.
Yeah.
We did.
Yeah.
So what?
But we would have screwed up even more if we tried nothing because
That's
we were afraid
exactly right. I
of
agree.
advancing knowledge.
I think Dr. Rowe had a question or a comment, and then we can wrap it up because we're at 1:15 already.
I understand that you guys got a new grant funded recently, landscape level ecosystem services.
No, that one didn't get funded. We've got one in. So we are
Going
also,
to get funded on an exciting new idea.
we hope. We've looked at ecosystem services outside of the city. You are all aware of the 4Fry project that's become we were looking at this issue of forest management, water supply, silt to the reservoirs, recreational opportunities, fire frequency. Again, trade-offs. So for us, by and large, it seems to favor forest restoration, which means less forest, not more. So we're looking at getting that funded. Now, the one we have funded right now, which is partially connected to ecosystem services, but again, puts the people in nature. Surprisingly, a lot of our projections of disease dynamics the world over looks at, so in any given contact, there's a certain chance, having hugged Stacy, that I'm going to get her cold. And that was a contact, that we purposefully hugged each other. We hadn't seen each other in a while. And what the modelers assume is that my behavior throughout the course of, say, a flu epidemic will not change, and that I will continue to hug everyone I see. Well, that doesn't happen. People are smarter than that. And so we're working with a bunch of economists to endogenize the ways in which people, either in human-to-human contact or how they're managing their livestock, would alter the course of the disease. So another, again, digression is when they had the foot and mouth outbreak in Britain and the UK, you sometimes wonder why people can't think more rationally about people and the incentives they're setting up. They announced sort of 3 days ahead of time, 3 days from now you are not going to be allowed to move your sheep, goats, cattle, whatever you've got across streets. So what happened to midnight before that? Everyone's busy moving everything all over the damn landscape. You know, the other thing is if your animals had the disease and they eradicated your stock, you got full compensation. And if they didn't, if you couldn't prove that they had it. So there was sort of there was a lot of incentive to get your animals sick. Because they were compensating based on a high market price for the stock. So there was a lot of incentive to get your animals sick. And so we just totally, but the point is that people actually responded. Well, another study we looked at is how much TV viewing went up in Mexico in that big outbreak. And so what were people doing to distance themselves from getting sick? And people do respond. So we're looking at human to wildlife to domesticated animal contact, the choices people make about that, management of domesticated animals, and human-to-human contact. So we're looking at one specific ecosystem service.